The price of peace. The aroma of freshly ground Colombian Supremo filled the Harding kitchen, mingling with the sizzle of bacon in the cast iron pan. Richard, a man who appreciated the quiet rhythms of the morning, savored the moment. He watched the steam curl from his mug, the muted sounds of NPR drifting from the countertop radio. Outside, the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates lay bathed in the soft glow of dawn, a picture of suburban tranquility he'd worked hard to achieve. He flipped the bacon, its crisp edges a testament to his culinary precision, and a small smile touched his lips. Life, he thought, was undeniably good. His daughter, Lily, padded into the kitchen, her blonde hair a tousled halo around her sleepy face. "Morning, Dad," she mumbled, reaching for a banana. "Morning, sleepyhead," Richard replied, placing a plate of bacon and toast in front of her. He watched her eat, a familiar warmth spreading through him. These small moments, these everyday rituals, were the anchors of his world. Later, after Lily had left for school and the dishes were tidied, Richard settled into his home office. The rhythmic clatter of his keyboard filled the room as he reviewed reports for First National Bank. He was deep in a discussion about loan restructuring when the mailman's familiar knock echoed through the house. Among the usual bills and junk mail, a cream-colored envelope with the official seal of the county assessor's office caught his eye. He slid it open with a letter opener, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Property tax notices always carried a certain weight, a reminder of the price of ownership. The initial shock came from the sheer size of the figure. It wasn't a small increase, not a mere adjustment for inflation. This was an exorbitant leap, almost double what he'd paid the previous year. Richard reread the notice, his brow furrowing in confusion. There had to be a mistake. He scanned the details, checking the assessed value of his property. It had inexplicably skyrocketed. He grabbed his reading glasses and carefully examined the fine print. A new line item, almost hidden among the bureaucratic jargon, jumped out at him. Commercial development assessment. Commercial development? On his property? Richard felt a surge of adrenaline. He grabbed his car keys and headed out the door, the unanswered questions churning in his mind. He drove the familiar streets of Willow Creek, the manicured lawns and meticulously trimmed hedges suddenly seeming alien, almost mocking. He turned onto his street, the cul-de-sac coming into view, and that's when he saw it. Where his prized patch of undeveloped land had always stood, a gaping wound in the green uniformity of Willow Creek, now buzzed with activity. Construction workers swarmed around a half-finished structure, the skeletal frame of what was undeniably a gas station rising against the clear blue sky. The stench of asphalt and diesel fumes hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sweet scent of honeysuckle that usually permeated his property. Richard slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. A gas station on his land. It was a brazen act, a violation that stole his breath. He stared at the scene, the idyllic facade of Willow Creek shattering around him like glass. The price of peace, he realized, was far higher than he could have ever imagined. The HOA confrontation. Richard adjusted his tie, the knot feeling like a noose tightening with each passing minute. He reread his notes, highlighting key points with a nervous energy. He'd spent the better part of the week compiling evidence, cross-referencing property lines, and poring over the HOA bylaws. He had a solid case, a clear violation of zoning regulations and the blatant disregard for resident input concerning the gas station. He just needed to present it calmly and rationally. He walked the perfectly manicured path to the community clubhouse, the scent of freshly cut grass doing little to soothe his fraying nerves. Inside, the room felt stuffy and oppressive. Bart Thompson, the HOA president, sat at the head of the table, radiating an almost palpable smugness. Agnes Plumtree, a woman whose voice could curdle milk, sat beside him, her eyes narrowed in anticipation. "Ah, Richard," Bart drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "So glad you could make it. We were just about to start discussing more important matters." Richard took a seat, ignoring the barb. "I'd like to address the board regarding the recent construction of the gas station." Bart chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "The gas station? An excellent addition to our community. Wouldn't you agree? So convenient. Conveniently built on land zoned for recreational use, and without any proper community consultation," Richard countered, his voice tight but controlled. He presented his meticulously prepared documents, laying them out on the table. These clearly demonstrate the zoning violations and the lack of transparency in the decision-making process. Agnes Plumtree leaned forward, her face contorted in a sneer. Transparency? We voted on it. It was a democratic decision. A vote held with deliberately misleading information and without informing all homeowners, Richard corrected, his patience wearing thin. Many residents were unaware of the specifics, and the zoning implications were completely omitted. Bart waved a dismissive hand. Details, details. The gas station is generating revenue for the community. It's a win-win. At the expense of property values and the overall quality of life, Richard retorted, his voice rising slightly. This sets a dangerous precedent. What's next? A sewage treatment plant in the middle of the park. Bart's smile tightened. Don't be absurd, Richard. We're simply looking out for the best interests of the community. By ignoring regulations and silencing dissenting voices, Richard pushed back, his frustration boiling over. Agnes gasped dramatically. Silencing? We're giving you a chance to speak, aren't we? Richard stared at them, a chilling realization dawning. They weren't interested in facts, evidence, or even a semblance of fairness. They were entrenched, arrogant, and determined to maintain their control, regardless of the consequences. I see, Richard said, his voice now dangerously quiet. This isn't about what's best for the community, it's about what's best for you. He gathered his documents, his movements deliberate and precise. You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. He turned and walked out of the clubhouse, the scent of freshly cut grass now feeling like a mockery of the manicured facade that concealed the rot beneath. He knew what he had to do next, and it was going to be far less polite, following the money. The photocopier in the community center's cramped office wheezed, delivering a ream of HOA financial records into Richard's waiting hands. The air hung thick with the cloying scent of mildew and neglected coffee. His back protested, his vision blurred from deciphering the dense figures, yet his resolve held firm. He'd unravel this financial tapestry. He'd started with the current budget, a confusing document teeming with imprecise entries and unervingly round figures. The afternoon devolved into a painstaking audit, charting expenditures, scrutinizing invoices, wrestling with the HOA's suspect accountant, Mrs. Davison. The self-proclaimed treasurer appeared to believe sundry expenses provided sufficient justification for a considerable slice of their annual funds. Flipping to the liability section, a shock ran through him. A series of loans, originating from a single source, First National Bank. His bank. A chill seized his gut. He absorbed the amounts, the conditions, the due dates. The HOA was deeply indebted, financially tethered to First National. These were no mere lines of credit. They were substantial, critical lifelines. He raked his fingers through his hair, agitation building. This was a tangled web. He hadn't foreseen this connection, this direct artery linking the proposed gas station to his own domain. A surge of indignation coursed through him. Had they been aware? Had they intentionally approached First National, anticipating favorable terms? Or were they merely lucky, perhaps naively uninformed? He gathered the documents, the stack of evidence growing heavier in his arms. He needed access to the source material. The original loan solicitations, the credit assessments, the internal communications. He needed to understand the approval process, the authorizing signatures, the posted collateral. That information was within reach, but accessing it covertly would be the true test. Stepping out of the community center, the twilight sun stretched elongated shadows across the meticulously kept lawns. He cast a look at the unauthorized gas station, now gilded by the sunset. A flicker of something potent stirred within him. He was First National CEO, the very gatekeeper of capital. The HOA, despite its posturing and legal threats, was beholden to him, to his institution. He slid into his car. The leather cool against his back, he ignited the engine, the purr a grounding presence in the hushed evening. The stakes had shifted. He wasn't solely safeguarding his property anymore. He was championing something larger. Accountability, integrity, wielding his influence to remedy a manifest injustice. And for the first time since this ordeal began, Richard sensed the possibility of victory. Yet it was a precarious course that he knew that Mrs. Davison and the HOA would likely overreact to the news of their loan being revoked. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel. It was time for action, time to pick up the phone. The abuses of power. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows from the half-finished gazebo onto Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias. Richard watched from his living room window. His jaw tight. Two men, both built like refrigerators and wearing the same smug expression as Bart Thompson, were lecturing the elderly woman, gesticulating wildly at a small, barely noticeable crack in her garden wall. Mrs. Henderson, her shoulders slumped, simply nodded, her face etched with defeat that he knew what they were doing. Intimidation, pure and simple. He'd seen it before. This subtle bullying disguised as upholding community standards at IT was always the same playbook. Target the vulnerable, nitpick minor infractions, and wear them down with bureaucratic jargon until they capitulated. Richard's fingers drummed a silent rhythm against the window pane. He'd initially dismissed the HOA's actions as petty squabbles, the kind that arose in every planned community. But the incident with Mrs. Henderson, coupled with the growing list of questionable decisions, was starting to paint a disturbing picture. Later that week, driving past the construction site for the new community clubhouse, Richard noticed something else. That a section of the foundation was clearly encroaching on the designated setback line, violating several local building codes. That he pulled over, his stomach churning. That IT was blatant, almost arrogant in its disregard for regulations. He took pictures, the camera clicking a stark counterpoint to the drone of the construction equipment. He found Agnes Plumtree at the coffee shop, her usual table cluttered with HOA documents. He approached, bracing himself. "Agnes," he said, trying to keep his voice level, "I noticed the foundation of the clubhouse. It seems to be over the setback line." Agnes waved a dismissive hand, not even looking up. "Oh, that. Bart's already taken care of it. A minor adjustment. Nothing to worry about." "A minor adjustment that violates building codes?" Richard pressed, his voice rising slightly. Agnes finally looked up, her eyes narrowed. "Richard, darling, you really need to stop worrying about every little thing. Bart knows what he's doing. He's got the best interests of the community at heart." Richard stared at her, speechless. How could she be so blind? Or was she deliberately turning a blind eye? He knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his gut, that this wasn't just about petty squabbles anymore. This was about power, unchecked and abused. Back in his quiet study, the pictures from his camera glowed on the screen. He thought of the bank, of the leverage he held. He'd always kept his professional life separate from his personal one, believing in the sanctity of that divide. He'd hesitated to use his position, fearing it would be seen as an abuse of his own power. But as he looked at the images of the encroaching foundation, at the digital faces of the intimidated homeowners, he felt something inside him harden. Maybe the only way to fight abuse was to wield the very power that enabled it. The question was he willing to cross that line? And if he did, what would it cost him? Leveraging the loan. Richard stared at the spreadsheet, the HOA's financial records bleeding into one another in a dizzying array of numbers. He needed to tread carefully. Blatant interference would raise flags, both within the bank and, more importantly, with the regulators. But he couldn't just stand by and watch the Seven Oaks HOA merrily pave its way to ruin, and possibly his own. He buzzed for Sarah, his meticulous and ever-efficient assistant. "Sarah, I need to convene a meeting. All the loan officers who handle the Seven Oaks HOA portfolio. First thing tomorrow. Anything specific I should note for the attendees, Mr. Harding?" Sarah inquired, her fingers already flying across the keyboard. "Just a general review of their risk assessment. We need to ensure we're being prudent, given current market conditions," Richard said, choosing his words carefully. He added, almost as an afterthought, "And bring me the latest data on community association delinquencies nationwide." The next morning, the conference room hummed with the low thrum of anticipation. 4 loan officers sat around the mahogany table, their faces varying from cautious to mildly apprehensive. Richard, seated at the head, projected an air of calm authority he didn't entirely feel. "Good morning, everyone. As you know, Seven Oaks represents a significant portion of our community lending portfolio," he began, his voice measured. "Given the complexities of managing a large homeowners association, I wanted to ensure we're all on the same page regarding our risk assessment. Let's start with a general overview of their current financial standing. Margaret, a seasoned officer with a sharp eye for detail, presented first, highlighting the HOA's history of prompt payments and generally sound financial management. Richard listened attentively, making occasional notes, his expression neutral. He then subtly steered the conversation towards potential vulnerabilities. Margaret, that's encouraging. But have we considered the impact of recent lawsuits on their reserve funds? I understand there are a few ongoing disputes regarding property lines and unauthorized construction. Richard paused, letting the implication hang in the air. He then gestured towards the data Sarah had provided. And while Seven Oaks' delinquency rate is currently low, national trends suggest a potential increase in defaults among community associations. Are we adequately factoring that into our models? He watched as the officers subtly shifted in their seats, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. John, a younger officer eager to prove himself, chimed in. We could consider lowering their credit line, perhaps, or increasing the interest rate to reflect the heightened risk. Richard nodded slowly. Those are certainly options worth exploring. I'm not suggesting any drastic measures at this stage, but I want us to be proactive. Let's revisit this in 2 weeks with revised risk assessments, taking into account the factors we discussed. As the meeting adjourned, Richard felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. He had walked a fine line, subtly influencing the officers without explicitly dictating their decisions. He'd introduced the idea that the HOA was a risk, but it was up to them to reach the conclusions that he wanted. It was a gamble, but he was betting on the ingrained risk aversion of bankers. And, for now, it was the only weapon he had. The bank's decision. The air in the conference room hung thick with the scent of stale coffee and nervous anticipation. Richard sat at the polished mahogany table, a knot tightening in his stomach around him. The bank's loan officers shuffled papers, their faces etched with varying degrees of concern. Sunlight streamed through the panoramic window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the somber mood. All right, Brenda, a seasoned loan officer with a no-nonsense attitude, cleared her throat. Let's get down to it. The Stone Creek HOA loan. Richard, you initiated the review. Perhaps you could start. Richard pushed a file forward. As you all know, the HOA's financial statements have been unconventional, to say the least. Recent expenditures, coupled with declining property values in the area, raise serious questions about their ability to meet their obligations. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've flagged some irregularities that require closer scrutiny. Specifically, the significant increase in infrastructure maintenance costs and the corresponding lack of detailed documentation. A murmur rippled through the room. Sarah, the youngest of the group, her face pale, spoke up. But freezing their lines of credit? That's drastic, isn't it? They rely on those loans for ongoing projects, landscaping, community events. Drastic, perhaps? Brenda countered, her voice firm. But responsible. We have a fiduciary duty to protect the bank's assets. Richard's concerns are valid. We can't ignore potential red flags. She glanced around the table, her gaze settling on each officer in turn. Are there any dissenting opinions? Silence. The weight of the decision pressed down on them. Richard watched, his heart pounding. He hadn't explicitly stated his desired outcome, but he knew his concerns had resonated. He hoped his actions were just and wouldn't have unintended consequences. Okay, Brenda said finally, the decision etched in her expression. Based on the information presented and the potential financial risks, I recommend we freeze all further disbursements to the Stone Creek HOA, pending a thorough audit of their financials. All in favor. A chorus of I filled the room, a collective exhale of nervous energy. Richard added his own affirmation, the sound feeling heavier than he expected. Later that afternoon, Brenda approached Richard in his office. The sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across his desk. She stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. The paperwork's been filed, she said, her voice flat. The HOA has been notified. Their loans are frozen, effective immediately. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Richard leaned back in his chair, A strange mix of relief and unease swirling within him. He had acted on principle, but the implications of his actions were only beginning to dawn on him. The battlefield had shifted from his property line to the sterile confines of the bank, and he was now fully engaged in a war he hadn't anticipated. He could only wonder what the HOA's next move would be. Backlash and accusations. Bart Thompson's face, already florid from the midday sun he'd been basking in by the community pool, deepened to a shade of furious purple. The phone felt slippery in his sweating hand as he listened to the bank manager drone on about unforeseen circumstances and a temporary freeze on all HOA loans. The words were meaningless corporate jargon, but the subtext was deafening. Richard Harding? That's absurd, Bart bellowed, ignoring the startled looks from Mrs. Higgins and her poodle, Fluffy. We have a signed agreement. We have permits. This is a personal vendetta. The bank manager, clearly flustered, stammered something about needing to consult with his superiors before abruptly ending the call. Bart hurled the phone onto a nearby lounger cushion, the impact barely registering against the rage simmering within him. This couldn't be happening. The new clubhouse, the one that would cement his legacy as HOA president, was dead in the water. All because of Harding and his ridiculous accusations. He stormed back to his house, already formulating a plan. Harding wanted a war? He'd get one. The next morning, the Lakeside Living community newsletter landed in every mailbox. The headline, splashed across the front page in bold, accusatory font, screamed, "Richard Harding, abusing power, jeopardizing our community." The article, ghostwritten by Bart but attributed to concerned residents, painted Harding as a disgruntled individual with a personal axe to grind, exaggerating minor grievances into a full-blown assault on the HOA. He hinted darkly at ulterior motives and questioned his fitness to serve as a bank CEO, implying his actions were financially motivated and self-serving. Agnes Plumtree, ever the loyal soldier, spearheaded the social media campaign. Within hours, the community Facebook group was flooded with posts echoing the newsletter's sentiments. Photos of Harding's house were circulated, accompanied by sarcastic comments about his excessive landscaping. One particularly nasty meme depicted him as a Scrooge McDuck character, swimming in a vault of HOA funds. The local news picked up the story that a reporter, microphone in hand, ambushed Harding as he was leaving for work. "Mr. Harding, how do you respond to allegations of abusing your position to harm the Lakeside Living community?" The camera flashed incessantly, blinding him. He mumbled a no comment and hurried to his car, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes burning into his back. The backlash was swift and brutal. Online comments ranged from skeptical to downright hostile. Even friendly neighbors now averted their gaze, their smiles replaced with wary suspicion. Richard Harding, once a respected figure in the community, was now a pariah. He was alone, facing a storm of accusations, and Bart Thompson was just getting started. Town hall showdown. Richard's tie felt like a noose tightening with each breath. He adjusted it for the 10th time in as many minutes, the silk scratching against his clammy skin. The projector hummed, casting a pale rectangle on his living room wall, filled with spreadsheets, satellite images, and damning financial statements. Hours he'd spent poring over them, converting them into a coherent narrative, a weapon against the coming storm. He was alone. His wife had retreated to her sisters, claiming she couldn't bear to watch him self-destruct. He hadn't tried to stop her. Maybe she was right. He took a swig of lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste a stark contrast to the bland oatmeal he'd forced down. He needed to be sharp, focused. Tonight was make or break. He glanced at the clock. 6:30. Town hall started in an hour. The community center was already buzzing when he arrived. At a low, angry hum filled the air, punctuated by the clatter of folding chairs and the murmur of agitated voices. Richard felt 100 pairs of eyes bore into him as he walked to the designated speakers area. Agnes Plumtree, her face flushed with righteous anger, stood near the entrance, filming him with her phone. "Here he is, folks, the man who's trying to ruin our town," she announced, her voice amplified by the phone's microphone. Bart Thompson was already seated at the head table, radiating an air of smug confidence that made Richard's stomach churn. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. He looked like a king surveying his domain. The meeting was called to order, But the room was far from orderly. Shouts and accusations erupted as soon as Bart opened the floor for discussion. Richard waited, trying to ignore the rising tide of hostility. When his turn finally came, he walked to the podium, the spotlight burning into his face. He ignored the jeers and catcalls, focusing on the prepared statement in front of him. He began by outlining the illegal land seizure, presenting the satellite images showing the gas station's encroachment on private property. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Then, he laid out the evidence of HOA mismanagement, the inflated contracts, the diverted funds, the blatant self-dealing. The spreadsheets, projected onto a large screen, revealed a pattern of corruption that was impossible to ignore. Bart shifted in his seat, his smirk replaced by a thin, hard line that he tried to interrupt, to deflect, but Richard pressed on, his voice gaining strength with each revelation. He showed the documentation he'd found that implicated Bart in personally signing off on the land grab, circumventing legal procedures. He explained how Bart had siphoned off funds meant for community projects into shell corporations controlled by his relatives. The room was silent now, the air thick with tension. Even Agnes Plumtree had stopped filming, her mouth agape. Richard looked directly at Bart, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about ruining the town," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's about saving it." Justice served. The sterile conference room buzzed with forced civility. Bartholomew Bart Thompson, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's Arctic temperature, finally broke the silence. "All right, Harding. We've reviewed your proposal." He spat the word like it tasted sour. Richard sat across the polished mahogany table, outwardly calm. Though the past weeks had carved deep lines into his face, he had expected a fight. But the sheer, venomous hatred emanating from Bart was almost palpable. Agnes Plumtree lurked by the door, her phone held aloft, ready to record any perceived transgression. Richard ignored her. "It's not a proposal, Bart. It's a correction. You built a gas station on my land. Illegally. This settlement simply restores what was mine to begin with and compensates me for damages." Bart scoffed, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. "Damages? You practically held the entire community hostage, cutting off our funding." "You left me no choice," Richard countered, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He could feel Agnes's judgmental gaze boring into him. He pressed on. "The damage to my reputation, the emotional distress, these are quantifiable." After what felt like an eternity of tense negotiations, fueled by weak coffee and simmering resentment, they reached an agreement. The HOA would deed the land back to Richard and pay a substantial sum to compensate for damages and legal fees. Bart signed the documents with a flourish of spite, his face a mask of barely concealed fury as Richard walked back onto his property. The afternoon sun felt different, brighter, warmer. The skeletal framework of the half-finished gas station stood as a monument to Bart's hubris. He ran a hand over the survey stakes, the cold metal grounding him that it was his again. Later, sitting on his porch, the settlement papers heavy in his lap, Richard thought about the price of justice. He'd used his power, wielded it like a weapon, and while he'd won, the victory felt tainted. Agnes's accusations echoed in his mind. Was he truly just trying to protect his own interests? Or had he become the very thing he despised? Someone who used their position to bully others? He stared out at the horizon, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about reclaiming his land. It was about using his influence, his resources, to fight injustice wherever he found it. He had been given a platform, albeit a precarious one, and he would use it to amplify the voices of those who couldn't be heard. He wouldn't be defined by Bart's narrative, or Agnes's accusations. He would define himself. The fight was far from over. It was only just beginning.